In the high plains of Montana in the fall of 1919, Earl Sutton was doing something that made no sense. To anyone who rode past his small homestead, the sight was baffling. He had a large water barrel, and into it he was dumping bucket after bucket of a strange gray slurry. It was a thick, wet, oatmeal-like sludge. He'd haul it over to his log cabin and begin, with his bare hands and a small trowel, forcing the disgusting paste into every gap and seam between the logs. His neighbors watched him from the road. They saw the stacks of old newspapers he'd hauled from the train depot. They saw him shredding them, soaking them, mashing them into a pulp. They shook their heads. They thought he'd lost his mind. The man was packing wet trash into the walls of his own home, and with the first hard frost just weeks away, it seemed like a special kind of madness. When the brutal winter of 1919 hit, a winter that would go down in the record books, that crazy paper sludge would prove the difference between survival and misery. It would prove the difference between shivering desperation and quiet dignity. If you want to see the number that made the most experienced builders in the valley go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet ex-Navy man understand about heat and cold that every other frontiersman in Montana had missed? If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Earl Sutton wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old former Navy Seabee, a man who had spent years building necessary things in impossible places. He wasn't a master carpenter. He was an engineer of necessity. His time in the service hadn't taught him how to build a handsome, traditional cabin. It had taught him how materials actually behaved under extreme stress. It taught him what failed in the bitter cold of the Aleutians and what held in the blistering heat of the Philippines. He understood pressure, moisture, and the relentless, invisible physics of temperature. He and his wife, Margaret, and their two young daughters, Sarah and Emily, had moved to the valley the year before. Their cabin was solid. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. The logs were sound, the roof was tight, the foundation was stone. Earl had chinked it himself with the traditional mix of mud, grass, and lime. It looked exactly like every other cabin for 100 miles. And like every other cabin, it bled heat like a sieve. Their first winter, the winter of 1918, had been a brutal lesson. It wasn't just the cold, it was the wind. A constant scouring wind that never seemed to stop. Earl burned through 7 cords of wood. 7. He was up every 3 hours at night feeding the cast iron stove that glowed cherry red, yet seemed to project its heat no more than 5 feet. Margaret stuffed rags and spare wool along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff and hard as planks by morning. Frost bloomed on the inside of the walls, delicate, cruel flowers of ice. The emotional toll was worse than the physical one. His daughters, 8 and 10, slept in their coats and hats, burrowed under every blanket they owned. They did their school lessons huddled by the stove, their fingers too numb to properly hold a pencil. Earl watched his wife's hands crack and bleed from the constant cycle of hot stove and cold cabin. He saw the quiet desperation in her eyes. This wasn't living. It was a grim 4-month battle of attrition against the cold, and they were losing. That thought nagged at him all spring and summer. He had built the cabin correctly, by the book. Everyone built this way. So why did it perform so poorly? He started watching, observing. He noticed how on a windy day, even a mild one, a candle flame would flicker near the walls. He saw tiny puffs of dust move when a gust hit the west side of the cabin. The wind wasn't just making the air outside colder. It was actively invading his home. It was a physical presence, a thief that pushed through the chinking, forcing the warm air out and pulling the cold air in. The problem wasn't the logs. The logs were thick, a good foot of solid wood. The problem was the thousands of linear feet of gaps between them. The daub and chinking looked solid, but it was porous. It was full of tiny, microscopic cracks and channels. To the wind, his walls were a net, not a barrier. That's when the insight hit him, a memory from his time in the Navy. He remembered building makeshift structures in brutal, windswept locations. The single most important factor in keeping a structure warm wasn't the thickness of the walls, but how well you stopped air movement. An inch of perfectly still, trapped air was a better insulator than a foot of porous stone that let the wind blow through it. Still air insulates. Moving airstrips heat. It was that simple. His plan formed. It was simple in concept, but radical in practice. He needed to replace his chinking not with a better version of the same thing, but with something fundamentally different. He needed a material that would be absolutely dense, completely seamless, and fill every single microscopic void. He needed to make his walls monolithic. He needed to make them airtight. And he had to do it with materials that cost next to nothing. He had a family to feed. There was no money for fancy solutions. He started gathering old newspapers. The work began in late September, as the aspen trees were turning a brilliant, fiery yellow. The first frosts were already kissing the valley floor in the mornings. Earl knew he was on a clock. His material needed time to dry and cure before the deep cold set in. He sourced his primary material for free. The station agent at the train depot was happy to let him haul away months of accumulated newspapers and shipping manifests. He loaded his wagon high with bundles of paper, a mountain of old news and forgotten stories. His second ingredient was water from his well. The third was a small but crucial addition. He'd found a half-dozen split sacks of powdered lime at the back of the trading post, deemed unsellable due to moisture exposure. The owner let him have the lot for 50 cents. The process was brutally simple and labor-intensive. First, he had to remove all the old chinking. With a hammer and a pry bar, he spent a week chipping and scraping away the dried mud and grass from between every log, inside and out. The cabin looked skeletal, with dark gaps exposing it to the daylight. Margaret watched with a worried expression. Their home felt vulnerable, opened up to the elements just as the weather was turning. Then came the mixing. He filled a 50-gallon barrel with water and began shredding the newspaper, feeding it into the barrel and stomping it down with a heavy timber. He'd let it soak overnight, then spend hours the next day churning it with a long-handled paddle, breaking down the fibers until it became a thick, uniform gray pulp. It looked like lumpy, wet cement. To this slurry, he would add a few shovels of the lime. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. He was creating a primitive form of cellulose insulation. The paper, being wood fiber, had inherent insulating properties. But the real genius was in the application. By packing it in wet, the slurry flowed and conformed to every crack, every knot, every splintered surface inside the log channel. It left no air pockets. Zero. As it dried, the water would evaporate, and the cellulose fibers would shrink and interlock, pulling themselves into a dense, surprisingly hard mass. The lime was key too. It would act as a fungicide and a pesticide, preventing the paper from rotting or becoming a home for insects. It also acted as a binder, helping the mixture cure to a near stone-like hardness. He began the application on the north wall, the one that took the brunt of the winter wind. He'd scoop the heavy, wet pulp onto a hawk, a flatboard used for holding plaster, and then force it into the gaps. He used a trowel, but more often, he used his hands, squeezing and pushing the material deep into the cavity until it was completely full, flush with the surface of the logs. It was slow, messy work. The gray paste covered his arms up to his elbows. Every hour of this work was an interruption of the normal seasonal flow. His neighbors were busy bucking their final cords of firewood, mending fences, preparing their livestock for the coming cold. Earl Sutton was playing with mud and trash. A rider would go past, slow his horse, Watch for a minute with a puzzled look, and then ride on, shaking his head. Margaret brought him a cup of coffee one afternoon. She stood watching him for a long time, her arms crossed against the chill wind. "Earl," she said, her voice quiet, "the women at the church circle were asking what you were doing. I didn't know what to say." Earl didn't stop his work. He forced another handful of pulp into a wide gap near the corner. "Tell them I'm fixing the walls." "It looks strange," she said, hesitant to voice her real concern. He paused and looked at his work. The clean, rustic lines of the log cabin were now interrupted by these smooth, gray, lifeless bands. It did look strange. It looked unnatural. He went back to explaining the principle, not to defend himself, but just to state the fact. "The problem isn't the logs, Margaret. It's the air. The wind gets in the cracks. This will stop it, all of it." He pointed to a section he'd finished the week before. It was already drying to a light gray, and when he knocked on it with his knuckles, it was surprisingly solid. "This is like the dead air in a double-pane window," he tried to explain. "We're making the whole house a double-pane window." The analogy didn't quite land. All she saw was her husband, covered in gray muck, fundamentally altering their home in a way no one had ever seen before, in a way that invited ridicule. The project took 3 weeks of relentless effort. By the time he was done, every single seam, inside and out, was sealed with the paper lime composite. From the outside, the cabin had lost its frontier charm. It looked like a log house someone had tried to crudely repair with concrete. It looked like a barn had eaten a house. The total cost was itemized on a slip of paper in their cash box. One entry, wall repair. The cost, 50 cents. The 50 cents for the spoiled lime. The newspaper and water were free. His labor was his own. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Margaret stood at the doorway and looked at the finished product. The cabin felt different already. Quieter. The ever-present whistle of the wind through the walls was gone. There was just a deep, muffled silence. "Earl," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." Earl came and stood beside her. He put an arm around her shoulders and looked at his handiwork. He didn't see a strange-looking house. He saw a fortress against the cold. "Let them," he said. And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw insanity. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with polite, professional concern. Calvin Drecker ran the sawmill and had built, by his own count, half the cabins in the valley. He was a respected man, a master of his craft, and he saw Earl's work as an affront to common sense. He rode over one Saturday, dismounted, and walked a slow circle around the cabin, running a skeptical hand over the hard, gray chinking. "Earl," he said, getting straight to the point, "I don't mean to tell you your business, but this is a mistake." Earl was splitting wood, his movements steady and economical. He stopped and leaned on his axe. "How so, Calvin?" "Paper holds moisture," Drecker said, with the certainty of a man who had worked with wood his entire life. "You've packed it in there wet. It's not going to dry clear through before the first deep freeze. Come January, that dampness in the middle is going to turn to solid ice, and ice expands. You know that. It'll expand and push your logs apart. It'll break the seal, ruin your foundation. You're building an ice wedge right into the heart of your own walls." It was a technical, specific objection, and it sounded perfectly reasonable. Earl considered this for a moment. He knew the lime would help pull the moisture out, and the sheer density would prevent deep frost penetration, but he wasn't going to argue physics with Calvin Drecker. Just trying something different, Calvin, was all he said. Drecker shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. Well, I hope for your family's sake it works. I'll set aside some extra cordwood for you. I got a feeling you're going to need it. The professional concern quickly curdled into public mockery. The trading post was the valley's social hub, and a man's reputation could be made or broken there. Jedediah, Jed Vance, a man who spoke twice as much as he worked, saw his chance to get a laugh. When Earl came in for flour and salt, Vance spoke up, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Heard Sutton's building his house out of yesterday's news," he boomed. "Guess that's all his opinion is worth, too." A few men chuckled. The cruel nickname was born. From that day on, the Sutton place was known as the Paper Palace. The gossip network lit up. Neighbors on their way to town would slow their wagons as they passed, pointing and whispering. At the Sunday church social, conversations would go quiet when Margaret approached a group of women. The looks they gave her were a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, as if she were the wife of the village eccentric. The pressure weighed on her heavily. One afternoon at a quilting circle, one of the older women, Mrs. Gable, took her hand. "Is everything all right at home, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "If you and the girls need a warm place to stay when the weather turns, our door is always open." The implication was clear. Her husband had failed her, and her home would be unlivable. Margaret felt a hot blush of shame and anger. She simply nodded and said, "Thank you for your kindness, but we'll be just fine." She left early that day and didn't go back for the rest of the season. Then came the official skepticism. Mr. Harrison, the county extension agent, paid them a visit. He was a man who lived by the book, his world governed by agricultural bulletins and university-approved techniques. He carried a clipboard and had a serious expression. "Mr. Sutton," he began, after his own inspection of the walls, "I've been hearing some interesting reports about your insulation methods. I have to say, this isn't in any manual I've ever seen." "I expect it's not," Earl said evenly. "The university recommends a mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw, or for a superior seal, oakum packed tightly and sealed with a lime mortar. There's proven science behind those methods. There's no science for this." "The only science I'm worried about is keeping my daughters warm," Earl replied, his patience wearing thin. But the cut that went deepest came from family. Margaret's brother, Thomas, came for a visit in late November. He was a good man, but a conventional one, deeply concerned with appearances and community standing. He took Earl aside, his face etched with worry. "Earl, you have to listen to me," he said, his voice low. "People are talking. They're not just saying you're eccentric. They're saying you're either too broke to buy proper chinking or too stubborn to ask for help. They're going to think you're incompetent. Maybe both." It's embarrassing for Margaret. This was the sharpest barb, the one that questioned not just his methods, but his ability to provide for his family. Earl looked his brother-in-law square in the eye. His voice was level, devoid of anger. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Tom. I'm trying to keep my family warm." By the first week of December, as the cold began to settle into the valley for good, not one person, save for Earl himself, thought he had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own stubborn folly. They were waiting for the cold to prove them right. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Earl Sutton right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1919 to 1920 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives. It wasn't just a cold winter, it was a relentless, brutal siege. The assault began quietly. December 8th, the thermometer dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A week later, December 15th, it hit -29. By Christmas Eve, the official reading at the county seat was -38 degrees, with a wind that never seemed to stop, pushing the effective temperature into the realm of pure danger. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above zero. Snow fell, but it was less like flakes and more like fine, sharp sand, driven horizontally by winds that gusted to 50 miles per hour. It scoured the paint from barns and piled into drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. It was the kind of cold that found every weakness, the kind of cold that broke things and people. The suffering in the valley was immediate and widespread. The Colby Ranch, a large operation with a dozen hands, was burning through 2 cords of pine a month and struggling to keep the main house at 42 degrees. Their newer wood was green, still full of moisture, and it hissed and sizzled on the fire, producing more smoke than heat. Every pound of water in a log requires over 1,000 BTUs of energy just to turn into steam, energy that is stolen before the wood itself can produce usable heat. The Colbys were losing the battle of thermodynamics. The Miller family down the creek from the Suttons ran out of dry, seasoned hardwood by the second week of the freeze. George Miller started burning fence posts he chopped out of the frozen ground. His wife was sick with a lung infection, and their children were constantly shivering, their faces pale. Chimneys began to fail. The rapid heating and cooling caused mortar to crack. Others, burning unseasoned wood, saw dangerous layers of creosote build up, leading to chimney fires that forced families to flee into the deadly cold. Calvin Drecker worked tirelessly, making emergency deliveries of cordwood, his horses steaming and straining in chest-deep snow. He found families huddled in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive. Livestock, even in their barns, began to freeze to death. It was a slow-motion disaster, a crisis unfolding in every supposedly solid, well-built cabin in the valley. And then people started noticing the Sutton place. A neighbor, struggling through the drifts to check on his cattle, stopped and stared. Every other chimney in the valley was belching a thick, dark plume of smoke, the sign of a stove being fed constantly, desperately. But the chimney on the Sutton cabin had only a thin, lazy wisp of pale smoke rising from it. It was the kind of smoke you'd see on a mild autumn day, not in the heart of a historic blizzard. Then, the unbelievable happened. The cabin door opened, and Earl Sutton stepped out. He was in his shirt sleeves, no coat, no heavy jacket, just a flannel shirt. He walked briskly to his woodpile, which seemed impossibly large and barely touched, picked up 3 logs, and walked back inside. The whole event took less than 20 seconds. But for the neighbor watching from 100 yards away, it was like seeing a ghost. A man in his shirt sleeves in a -40-degree blizzard. It defied all logic. It was impossible. Word, even in the isolating cold, began to trickle out. Something strange was happening at the paper palace, something that didn't make sense. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that paper-walled cabin didn't just surprise the valley, it was a number that bordered on miraculous. The vindication arrived on the back of a sleigh, pulled by 2 exhausted horses. It was the day before Christmas Eve, and the temperature outside was a staggering 42 degrees below zero. Calvin Drecker was on his last delivery run of the day. He'd saved the Sutton place for last, assuming they'd be in the most desperate need. He felt a grim sense of responsibility. He had warned Earl, and now he was coming to help him deal with the consequences of his folly. He had loaded extra cords of his best, driest birch onto the sleigh, a gift he knew the man would be too proud to ask for. He pulled up to the silent cabin and knocked heavily on the door, expecting to find a family huddled in misery. The door opened, and Margaret Sutton stood there. And the first thing that hit Calvin Drecker was the warmth. It wasn't the scorching, dry blast of an overstoked stove. It was a deep, steady, ambient warmth, like stepping into a different season. It rolled out of the doorway and washed over him, a physical shock against the brutal cold on his back. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight inside, and his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Behind Margaret, through the opening, Drecker saw the two girls, Sarah and Emily. They were sitting at the small kitchen table, drawing on pieces of paper. They were wearing simple, long-sleeved cotton dresses, not coats, not blankets. Dresses. "Margaret," he stammered, his breath frosting in the air. "Everything all right? Do you need wood?" She gave him a calm, genuine smile. A smile he hadn't seen on any other woman's face in 2 weeks. "We're fine, Calvin. We're managing just fine. Please come in out of that wind." He stepped inside, and the full reality of the cabin hit him. The air was warm and comfortable. It felt normal. He looked over at their wood box by the stove. It was more than half full. The stove itself wasn't glowing red. It was burning with a low, steady flame visible through the grate. "How much are you burning?" he asked, his voice low with disbelief. Earl looked up from the chair where he was reading a book. "About a quarter quart a week," he said quietly. "Maybe a little less on the days when the wind dies down." Calvin stared at him. The words didn't compute. "A quarter quart a week? Earl, George Miller is burning a quart a week just to keep his kitchen from freezing. The Colby Ranch is going through wood like it's kindling." His gaze then fell upon the wall thermometer, hung on the far wall, well away from the direct heat of the stove. He walked over to it, as if in a trance. He squinted in the dim light. The mercury was sitting clear, sharp, and undeniable. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees, Calvin whispered, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. Outside, the world was 42 degrees below zero. He did the math in his head, and the result was so staggering it felt like a lie. A temperature difference of 110 degrees? Let that sink in for a moment. 110 degrees. Drecker had families on his delivery list who were celebrating if they could keep their homes above 40. They were burning 4 times the fuel to achieve a result that was nearly 30 degrees colder. Instinctively, Calvin reached out and placed his bare hand on the interior wall, on one of the logs. It was cool, but it wasn't the biting, heat-sucking cold of every other cabin wall in the valley. Then he touched the gray chinking. It wasn't damp. It wasn't frozen. It felt inert, neutral. It was solid as rock and bone dry. The ice wedge he had predicted had never formed. The material had dried from the inside out, driven by the stove's heat, creating a perfect, monolithic seal. The narrator can now lay out the data with irrefutable clarity. The Colby Ranch, burning 1 cord per week to maintain an average temperature of 41 degrees. The Miller Place, burning 1.2 cords per week, a desperate effort to hold 38 degrees. The Sutton Cabin, burning 0.25 cords per week and living in a comfortable 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental. It wasn't a 10 or 20% improvement. It was categorical. Earl Sutton hadn't just built a warmer cabin. He had broken the entire equation of winter survival as they knew it. Calvin Drecker stood in the middle of the room for a full minute, saying nothing. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the peacefully sleeping girls in their beds, not buried under a mountain of pelts. He looked at Margaret, moving about the kitchen in a simple apron, her hands looking healthy and whole. Finally, he looked at Earl. He slowly shook his head, not in disbelief, but in dawning, profound respect. "Earl," he said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of a lifetime of assumptions being shattered. "We've been building houses in this valley for 50 years, and we've been doing it wrong." This wasn't just about a number on a thermometer. It was about the return of human dignity in the face of winter's assault. The Sutton children could do their schoolwork without their fingers going numb. Margaret could cook a meal without wearing 3 layers of wool. The family slept soundly through the night, no longer slaves to a ravenous stove that demanded to be fed every few hours. Earl's system hadn't just made the cabin warmer, it had turned winter from something to be survived into something that could simply be lived through. It gave them back their home. Weeks later, when the blizzard finally broke and the roads became passable, Mr. Harrison, the county agent, made a return visit. He arrived with a briefcase containing a calibrated thermometer and a hygrometer to measure moisture. He still carried an air of professional skepticism. He spent 2 hours in the cabin. He measured the temperature in the corners, near the floor, in the center of the room. He took readings from the wall surfaces. He reviewed Earl's meticulous, handwritten logbook, which detailed daily temperatures, both inside and out, alongside exact records of wood consumption. Mr. Harrison left that afternoon a changed man. He didn't say much, but as he packed his instruments, he simply shook Earl's hand and said, "Remarkable, truly remarkable." He had a notebook full of figures that defied everything in his university bulletins, and he knew he had a duty to report it. By the time the snows began to melt in the spring, the story of the Paper Palace was no longer a joke. It was a legend, and the legend began to spread. The first convert was George Miller. He had come too close to losing his wife that winter, and his pride was gone, replaced by a desperate need for a better way. That May, he asked Earl for help. Earl didn't gloat or lecture. He simply spent a weekend showing George how to mix the paper pulp and lime, how to pack the walls tight. It was back-breaking work, but by the end of it, the Miller cabin was sealed. The following winter, the Millers burned less than half the wood they had the year before, and their home was never colder than 60 degrees. That was the only proof the valley needed. Adoption of the method, which came to be known as Sutton sealing, was rapid. 7 more families re-chinked their homes that summer. By the fall of 1921, there were nearly 20 paper houses in the valley, each one a quiet testament to a better way. People shared leftover lime, traded newspapers, and helped each other with the labor. Mr. Harrison, the county agent, did his duty. He published a formal bulletin through the state's Agricultural Extension Service. It was titled, "An Unconventional but Effective Method for Insulating Log Structures in High Wind Environments." He never used Earl Sutton's name, respecting the man's quiet nature, but everyone in the county knew exactly who the bulletin was about. The paper was copied and passed from one county agent to another, and the technique began to spread across the northern frontier. What Earl Sutton had built in 1919, with 50 cents and a pile of trash, anticipated by nearly half a century what modern building scientists would rediscover and call an airtight thermal envelope. He had demonstrated that stopping convective heat loss, the movement of air, was far more important than simple insulation thickness. Years later, when a young reporter from a regional newspaper came to interview him about the legendary winter, Earl was typically terse. He was uncomfortable with the praise, seeing his solution not as a stroke of genius, but as simple, obvious logic. "Wasn't my idea," he said, gesturing to a stack of firewood. "Paper's made of wood fiber. I just used the wood in a different form to plug the holes. It's not new, it's just correct." The Sutton cabin stood for over 80 years. When it was finally dismantled by a great-grandson in the 1990s, the crew found the paper lime chinking was still there. It was gray, hard as stone, and had to be broken out with hammers. Behind it, the logs were perfectly preserved. The seal had held. The frontier was a harsh teacher. It didn't reward stubbornness, and it didn't reward tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded quiet observation over loud assumption, and irrefutable results over popular opinion. Earl Sutton wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just a man trying to keep his family warm. And in doing so, he taught an entire community a lesson in humility, physics, and the simple, elegant power of a correct idea. Drop a comment below. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? And if you enjoy stories of quiet competence proving everyone wrong, make sure you subscribe for more every single week. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the principles of cellulose insulation, air sealing, and thermal dynamics are based on real historical practices and established building science.